I've taught in Title I public high schools for over a decade. Education is woefully misunderstood by the general public, largely because most people trust the unreliable memory of their still developing minds from when they were going through school as kids to formulate their opinions of that profession as adults. This would be like a 30-year-old assuming he has an informed opinion about all medical professions today because he was a surgery patient at age 10. It doesn't help that, as with most professions, our popular media representations often lean into stereotypes and or sacrifice accurate professional representation on the altar of efficient and dramatic storytelling, or just cinematic laziness. I thought it might be helpful to respond to such instances, giving them credit when they do well and offering another perspective when needed. If this video is of value to the internet, there may be others to follow. I enjoyed 1988's Stand and Deliver years before I knew I'd be a teacher. It takes place in 81 and 82, and it's based on a true story about a highly effective teacher named Jaime Escalante, who I'll call Chemo in this video as his students did in the film. Huge point of clarification here. This video is not offering a direct critique of a famously effective teacher. Only his former students and colleagues who are alive today are even qualified to talk about his actual teaching, let alone critique it. I'm a modern teacher responding to a film from 33 years ago about events that happened 40 plus years ago. My critiques are exclusively about the filmmaker's choices and how things may work differently today based on what we see on the screen. For the sake of time and copyright concerns, I'll link the clips in the description and respond to them in order with timestamps. While the entire film is worth watching and talking about, I'll only be addressing classroom scenes. Before we get into the clips, I have to acknowledge a major issue with this film. For no reason, it presents Chemo as a first-year teacher fresh out of a career switch. He swoops into the school and is instantly a rock star teacher light years ahead of the veteran teachers at the same school. The real Escalante taught about 8 years before the first events in this film. I'm not saying that a first-year teacher can't outperform experienced teachers, and on the contrary, in most school divisions, the best-performing new teachers are better than the worst-performing old teachers, but that's comparing the positive and negative exceptions to both norms. This misrepresentation casually disrespects the time and talent it takes to become a great teacher, puts an unfair expectation of pressure on new teachers, and forces a lot of people to ask, well, why doesn't everyone just come in with zero experience and work hard enough so they can be as effective as Chemo was in his first year? There's a huge difference in zero teaching experience and nearly a decade of it. Scene 1, The Finger Man. Props to Chemo for calmly and quietly finding the confrontational student a seat at the start of this clip. When the student claimed he didn't need materials because he does the work in his head, Chemo wisely did not respond with a challenge or argument, but an honest question asking if the student knows the multiplication tables. The student basically gave him the finger. Chemo responded by lowering his elevation to match the seated student. He was too much in his face when he did this, but he did speak quietly, so even though it was public, the interaction stayed discreet. Rather than rushing to write up the student for escalating the conflict when the finger was given, Chemo demonstrated a few tricks about using fingers to remember multiplication tables. Though the teacher's body language was a bit too aggressive, this is a decent example of a teacher standing his ground without being disrespectful and or escalating a conflict. This is difficult as all students have different personalities and there's no single technique that will work for all students. These interactions are the most risky and challenging when you're still getting to know the students and they're still getting to know you. And in this case, this student is presenting as potentially hostile when they've only just met. There was a great little moment after the class when a student named Pancho asks if he can have his magazine back that was confiscated off screen. Chemo returned it and told him not to bring it to class again. Pancho was annoyed, but Chemo played that part of the interaction fairly well given the time he had. It's a huge risk to have a class policy where you're willing to confiscate personal items, because if a student is unwilling to comply, it creates a power dynamic with high potential for escalation and few outs for the teacher. The stakes and tensions get higher when attempting to take a much more expensive and personal item, like a student's cell phone. However the confiscation went down, in the 5-second interaction we see, Pancho and anyone watching learn that if Chemo takes something from you, he will give it back at the end of class. His goal is to keep you focused, not to take your belongings. Let's talk about the interaction at 2 minutes and 8 seconds in the clip. What Chemo did right was his body language. He didn't flinch and stood his ground. He resisted the temptation to either cower or physically retaliate to the student's physical gestures, as a lot of people might. Overall, this interaction wasn't great though. Again, it's really hard to get these things right when you've only known the students for a couple of minutes. Kimo's first mistake was only offering reactions. You often want to put the student in control of a conversation, but if you ask one to stay after class to talk, you need to bring something to that conversation. It's also unwise to make empty threats to students. He threatened to take off a student's finger for touching his pen. The student called his bluff by tapping the teacher's face, which is far worse, which was proving that he was all talk. Physically hostile students are especially aware that they can get away with more than teachers can, because they probably don't care about getting suspended nearly as much as the teacher cares about getting fired. Students respect kind sincerity much more than empty threats, and kind sincerity doesn't risk getting you fired. Scene 2. Tough guys don't do math. It's great that Kimo challenged students to learn beyond the basics, but it's terrible that he told them people who only know basic math are only qualified to work in gas stations or fry chicken for a living. While he wants his students to consider more than minimum wage jobs or crime for a living, he just insulted honest work, which is especially unfortunate in contrast to one student who just joked about robbing a gas station rather than working in one. The overwhelming majority of adults only know basic math, and his implication that you need advanced math for a good life is absurd. He also fails to explain what better jobs algebra will qualify them to have and why. 33 seconds into the clip, Pancho gave a joke answer, and Kimo used humor to move along without punishing him for at least engaging. Humor that stays lighthearted enough to not be misconstrued as victimizing a student is a powerful teaching tool. In that moment, instead of shutting down Pancho, he matched his humor and moved on. That's good. Kimo explained the concept of negative numbers with an analogy about digging and filling a hole in the sand. That's a simple and effective real-world connection, and good teachers have at least one, if not several, of those on hand for introducing any new concept. It's good that Kimo kept inviting disengaged students into the lesson rather than ignoring them, but he got a bit heavy-handed when publicly demanding Angel to answer his question. He semi-publicly taunted Angel about not answering for fear of public embarrassment. He even whispered a threat about snapping the kid's neck. This is a series of big risks because Angel is likely to lash out or shut down in response. Kimo gets lucky that he eventually does answer and does so correctly because it could have gone much worse. Kimo's talking quietly, but this was not like the Finger Man scene when the class was all working independently. This was in the middle of a lecture with everyone paying attention, so he put a lot of pressure on Angel, who was likely to bail out of the power struggle in any number of undesirable ways. Because it's a movie, the camera zooms in and mostly focuses on them like this is a one-on-one interaction with time otherwise frozen around them, but it's not. Teachers have to be careful and intentional about the social environment during every interaction. Interactions may require significant adjustment based on whether they are whole class, small group, partnered, or with individual students. I would have invited Angel to answer. And if he seemed quiet for fear of embarrassment, I would have had an encouraging chat with him later. When out of the public eyesight and earshot, I'd assure him that in my class, it's a safe environment to make mistakes, rather than publicly suggesting that his silence was due to fear. Scene 3. Ganas. I know I said I was going to work on classroom scenes here, but this is important too. So let's start with the good. Kimo went out of his way to teach more classes to give his students more opportunities, and while this should not be necessary, it is something that effective teachers sometimes do. He's also right that you need to have high expectations for students, as low expectations are objectively damaging. Imagine hiring a basketball coach who had the attitude that because his players were shorter than average, that they're just going to lose every game. How would that attitude affect the mood of his practices and the morale of his team? How would it affect the attitudes of his players and their own feelings of self-worth? Of course, if you set the bar unreasonably high, that brings problems of its own. Knowing your students well enough to hold them to high and achievable expectations is essential to effective leadership and teaching. The problem is that this scene paints the department chair as villainous for acknowledging the system is broken for expecting all students to perform to the same standards of accreditation when given radically different levels of student aptitude and home situations and school resources. Chemo has the right attitude to put in the work to give his students a chance to succeed despite their disadvantages, but that doesn't make it okay to ignore the systemic inequities. Imagine they're medics at war, and the general is asking why injured soldiers keep dying. The woman is explaining that they were only given band-aids to treat gunshot wounds. Chemo is particularly talented as a medic, and he keeps suggesting that, well, we just use more band-aids and work harder to make the most of it. That is better than just letting soldiers die, but it's also not a long-term solution to expect every medic to be equally talented and to keep patching bullet wounds with band-aids. This problem is expanded when Chemo suggests all they need is Ganas, or desire. Desire doesn't even qualify as the bare minimum that teaching takes, and Chemo himself has far more than just desire. He's a confident, competent mathematician who develops strong relationships with students. He obviously understands his content and pedagogy on a deep level. It takes teachers a lot of time and work to become that effective, no matter how much they and their students desire to get better. He also indicates that kids need Ganas to be successful. Again, while it's true, they also need a quality teacher, and they have to make sacrifices that they shouldn't have to in order to overcome the odds. While it's true that having desire and high expectations are essential to good teaching, this notion that those are all it takes, that's like claiming that just clearing a land of trees is all you need to do in order to build a house. That is required, but it's not even close to the final step needed for the desired result. Scene 4, the Gigolo problem. First, we saw a class ritual. There are tons of ways to have some fun with your students while starting a class or transitioning from one thing to the next. Teachers who expect teenagers to instantly go from high-volume hallway madness to sitting or working quietly to give them their silent attention don't understand classroom management. That's jarring, unrealistic, and frankly, it kills kids' energy rather than channeling it. Chemo's method got kids clapping in rhythm, so they were doing something fun as a team. It had them chanting back and forth, so the entire class was engaged in participating and interacting with each other. Then after a climax, they chanted lower and lower and lower until they gradually arrived at silence and their teacher had their full attention. This took 20 seconds. Ineffective teachers will spend 5 or more agonizing minutes fighting their students' natural desires to continue communicating with each other after entering a class or moving from one activity to another. These kinds of rituals are more common with younger kids, but can be effective with teens too. There are more subtle ways to accomplish the same thing. I like to have students in groups as a default arrangement. I have a short group activity for them every day as they enter the class. I have music playing softly in the background when they arrive. And when the group discussion time ends, rather than turning the music off, I turn it down gradually until it's silent. Then I ask at least one individual from each group to share something from the warm-up. Only after all of that do I expect the whole class to be ready to listen to me. This allows them to go from hallway chaos to talking in groups while listening to each other. During that time, it's much easier to manage 7 groups of 4 than it is to manage 28 individuals. Then they transition from talking in small groups to one student talking while everyone else listens to all students listening while the teacher talks. After the ritual, Chemo turns a math problem into a word problem about how many girlfriends multiple gigolos have based on a select available information. This is an acceptable but hokey technique that some math teachers use, and it's meant to make the question more interesting or relatable, or sometimes it's done to make them more challenging. Generally, forced word problems just point out the impracticality of advanced math for the average person. But that's another topic for its own video, though, so I won't harp on it here. Chemo does make some controversial jokes in this scene, like telling a girl who got the answer wrong that she's gonna end up pregnant barefooting in the kitchen. This is generally not a good idea, but she clearly understands that he's joking because he's making this joke after he's built a relationship with the student. She makes physical contact with him and laughs in response, so you know that she hasn't taken this personally. You can take professional risks like insult-based humor only with students who you know well enough to take them properly, and if you're prepared to get them thrown back at you. But the payoff is almost never worth it. Chemo's goal was to make the student and those around her laugh about getting it wrong, rather than making her feel sincerely bad about getting it wrong. That didn't require the risk of a joke that could have been taken as a personal insult. Chemo calls on volunteers to answer the question, but also calls on a student who didn't raise his hand. It's important to pull in all students for questions because otherwise you can only formatively assess the students brave enough to volunteer. And if you don't try to pull quiet students into conversations, they have fewer opportunities to be heard. Of course, you have to be prepared to give those students a graceful out if they don't want to answer or try to answer and get it wrong. 2 students raised their hands and were wrong. 1 blurted out a question without raising a hand. 1 blurted a wrong answer without raising a hand. 1 raised a hand to ask for the restroom break, and 1 was asked without raising his hand who got it wrong. Despite his lighthearted jokes, Chemo kept his patience until the 6th student entered the room with the correct answer. He used humor to keep probing the class without actually embarrassing anyone for their lack of math skill. He honors the students who offered their answers first, but when no one else offered, he didn't get hung up on students blurting out questions or answers without raising hands. He's focused on the content more than the class policies or structures. That's not to say that policies and procedures don't have a place, they just shouldn't be rigidly enforced at the cost of killing a student's enthusiasm or the vibe of the class. Scene 5. I want to teach calculus. This is another non-classroom scene, but it's important to discuss for the same reason as the other one. Chemo offers to teach overtime all summer to prepare 18 kids for the AP Calculus class the next year. There's very little reason not to let him do that, other than the argument that he is an effective teacher and creating a new class for top students will make him unavailable to reach other students who lack practical math skills. No one makes that argument, though, so it must not be an issue. The math department chair is presented as a villain again due to her low expectations, but she offers an understandable counterargument. She's worried about these kids, some of whom barely bothered to come to school before, now willing to take summer school and an AP class only to fail. Last year, about 40% of all kids nationwide who took the AP Calc test failed, and you can bet that nearly all of them worked hard to pass it. The kind of failure for those kids hits harder than the ones with a golden parachute or even just strong parental support systems. It's part of why a child's home life is so important. However, Chemo is right, that if you have kids who are willing and able to put in that kind of time, the school owes them the chance. To prevent those kids' confidence from shattering with failure, the school has to help them understand that it's okay to try at something and even try really hard at something and fall short, and that their value as people is not tied to a damn test score. Critical listeners may have noticed the admin claim that all the rooms are reserved for summer school, and you might wonder, how can that be? The school has fewer kids in the summer, so shouldn't there be an abundance of room, not a shortage? Most schools use summer break to do detailed cleaning they don't have time for during a busy school year, since that work is often done by custodial staff who have other duties during school days. Big projects like stripping and waxing the floors often get put off until the summer, so summer school tends to take place on a small section of the school that workers can save for last and finish quickly. That may be the reason for the shortage. There are ways around such a problem that basically require breaking tradition. I'll talk more about that after the next clip. Scene 6. Think cool. They solve the class space problem by meeting in a hot, smelly locker room over the summer with only oranges to mask the smell. Chemo has a decent line about how his American students will be more competitive on the global market if they catch up to the Japanese in mathematics, since they are the ones who know how to make everything. I want more in-depth examples in film and in real-life math classes of how all these numbers and letters on the board can offer students useful skills and power if they put in the time to master them. While it demonstrates the grit of students and teacher to learn under harsh conditions like this, there was probably a better solution than a locker room. They could have just added one more classroom to the section of the school that was being reserved for summer classes, if that is the reason that there was a lack of space. They could have had the students meet in one of the other schools in the district. There was almost certainly one room available somewhere that kids could have used for 5 hours a day. They could have had summer classes in the evenings after remedial classes ended, or just met at a public location like a library. It's not unique to education that people will often find all kinds of reasons that you can't do something new, because it's easy to get conditioned into believing that traditional structural challenges are impossible to work around. If something has seemingly always been the way it is, it feels reasonable to conclude that it always must be. But that's just not true. Scene 7. What's calculus? This is a quick but important scene where we see the teacher flirting with pushing students too hard. When I offer to teach kids outside of school hours, it's just that, an offer. It's a chance for additional support rather than a requirement. One thing Chemo does poorly in this film is considering his students' lives outside of school. I've had students who had routinely come to school deprived of sleep because they worked late every night and they had to get up extra early to take care of their siblings in the mornings. Many of my students who had jobs weren't just working to afford joyride gas money and new clothes for themselves, they worked to contribute to the bills at home. I could crush my relationship with a student like that if I scorned him or her for being unwilling or unable to give up more of an already insufficient supply of sleep or precious hours at work to come to take more of my class so that they might do better on a test. Looking it over holistically, while Stand and Deliver is an inspirational film based on a true story, you have to watch it with the same grain of salt that you would watch pretty much any Hollywood depiction of most professions. Hollywood suggests that attorneys spend most of their time standing in a courtroom and verbally arguing because that's the most dramatic and entertaining part of practicing law. It would be boring and impractical to make a courtroom drama that spends 10% of the film in the court and 90% back at the firm doing research and other extensive reading. Likewise, most entertainment media that features education only has it as a tangential part of the focus story, but even films like this, which focus on a single teacher, understandably focus on the fun part of the job, then crank the drama up to 11. Stand and Deliver never shows all the lesson plans, parent phone calls, documentation, grading, differentiated instruction for students on different levels and special needs, or mind-numbing faculty meetings that at least modern teachers endure. Education has also changed a lot since the day of PE instructors having to teach math or smoking in the teacher's lounge. What makes this film still worth watching 33 years later is the performance of the lead actor and the overlying message that teachers should never give up on students because of their circumstances and past academic performances. It's true that one caring, committed adult can and often does change the trajectory of a young person's life, but that's the overtone of the film. Its equally important undertone, which is more true today than ever, is a lot of students who fail in the context of traditional education are more accurately failed by traditional education, and they could be successful if the system were improved. My overall contention with the film, from the perspective of a modern teacher in a Title I school district, is that the film also glosses over the systemic problems its characters have to overcome and places the burden on the students and even more so on the teacher. At the risk of getting too political, this film unintentionally supports the status quo, suggesting that if teachers and students just work harder, everyone will be successful. Chemo has to volunteer additional hours during the school day and throughout his unpaid summer. The stress puts him in the hospital, and he defies doctor orders to return to work early so the kids don't have to rely on a music teacher to teach them calculus. This reinforces our bizarre obsession with teachers being martyrs, as if they aren't sacrificing enough by taking an intense, emotionally draining job for a far lower salary than the same level of education could net them in the private sector. In the film, this is Chemo's idea, but in modern reality, it's sadly common for school leadership to expect teachers to work above and beyond their contracted hours. Schools simply assign teachers more work than they have time to accomplish in a school day, so we routinely work overtime uncompensated. If teachers dare to ask if they'll be compensated for any of these things, they're maligned and guilt-tripped as if they're selfish and greedy or not caring about kids because they're not supposed to do this job for the money. I could elaborate, but the point here is that this film either intentionally or accidentally supports the notion that great teachers aren't just financial martyrs, but physical martyrs too. In films like this, you can get so caught up in rooting for the underdog that you forget how unfair it is that there even are underdogs in the context of educating our public. It's easy to root for a runner in a 400-meter race if his competition gets a 20-meter head start and he still manages to be competitive. But rather than cheering louder, we should be working to create conditions where everyone starts the race from the same place.